It was October 8th, 2015. The Conservatives were in the middle of an election campaign, and for Miss Kellie Leitch, it was her big break. She had been promoted to Minister of Labour, one of the top cabinet postings in Canada. She was about to unveil a plan that was going to save the Conservative Party. She took a deep breath, and she blew it.
RCMP unit in Canada's major cities: Toronto, Winnipeg, Vancouver, Calgary, and Montreal, to enforce the changes made to Canada's laws under the new Zero Tolerance for Barbaric Cultural Practices Act, and to support victims.
Kellie Leitch from the get-go was an unusual choice for the Conservative Party. There was never a party that was portrayed as being more anti-gay and anti-woman as the Conservative Party.
Even Harper sure hates me.
And yet, it attracted women and gays in droves. Kellie Leitch was especially unusual because she was also a doctor in a party that people perceived as being anti-science.
No respect for environment. Hopper man, it's time for you to go.
Leitch grew up as a Catholic and tells us to this day she is still a practicing Catholic despite their anti-gay prejudice. Moving past the internal contradictions in Leitch, she was one of the most qualified candidates to ever grace Ottawa, a gem that perhaps no party could have ever attracted in the past. She ends up with 22 letters at the end of her name.
Please understand that I do have 22 letters at the end of my name. I'm not an idiot.
She completed her bachelor's degree in just 3 years. Another 3 years later, she completed her MD. 4 years later, she completed an MBA in her spare time. And 3 years later, the Winnipeg native completed a residency in orthopedic surgery. A year later, she completed a residency in pediatrics. By the age of 32, she had completed education that others would do over a lifetime. Despite all this medical training, Leitch had a preference to work with her MBA. She only practiced for a single year, working as a pediatric surgeon at the Children's Hospital of Western Canada. Her interest turned to politics. She signed up for the Ontario PC Party. When she was 14, she had attempted to secure a seat, but she couldn't even pass a nomination. Despite all of her education, she did not have the sort of work experience profile required to secure a spot. She took up a position teaming at the University of Western Canada.
One part of the solution is training great leaders who know how to drive change. Another is ensuring that the great thinking moves from those ideas into becoming.
She rapidly increased her involvement in the conservative movement. In 2006, she sat as the chair of the advisory committee on the Children's Fitness Tax Credit. In 2008, she authored a report on children's health for Canada. In 2009, she was the chief strategist for the leadership bid for an Ontario PC candidate. It was also around this time that she started up her own NGO, the Kids Health Foundation. By the time she had become a CPC candidate, she was teaching at a business school and a medical university, had her own NGO, and was on the board of CanFAR, the National Research Chair, the YMCA, and Genome Canada. So when she said she would be running for a seat in a federal by-election, she was now a star candidate. She wasn't handed the seat. She was competing against a mayor. The nomination was made available because Helena Guergas was rejected from the party for being a part of a controversy.
This is a man who stood up a year ago, told the entire nation that he was aware of serious allegations, called in the RCMP, tossed me under a bus, and never told me what the allegations were, never gave me an opportunity to defend myself, and he's supposed to be the leader in the nation?
In the 2011 election, Leitch went head-to-head with Guergas and won. Leitch had attracted a lot of new voters to the Conservative Party and saw a surge in voting in this riding. Leitch sat as a backbencher for the first 2 years, learning from other ministers, and in 2013, she was given her chance, both Minister of Labour and Minister of Status of Women.
We've outlined
timed several times, we're about making sure that Canadians can be connected to available jobs. And when those individuals are not available, to make sure that a firm can prosper, the temporary foreign worker program is available to them.
Track record. We've been very fortunate. We are leading the G7 with regards to our economic capacity in some very uncertain times economically.
This was a very important step for Stephen Harper for optics. He now had 2 gay people in his cabinet and a plethora of women. For a party that was anti-woman and anti-gay, they certainly had a lot of them. Now with a scientist in the cabinet, they were also no longer anti-science. I mean, how could they? One of the hot-button issues of Harper's majority was missing and murdered Aboriginal women. A scathing report came out declaring that Aboriginal women are more likely to go missing and murdered than non-Aboriginal women. A total list was compiled of over 1,000 women gone missing over 100 years. Protesters of Idle No More protest used as a sign of contempt from the federal government. So in 2014, Leitch presented $25 million for more police resources into creating a DNA database and more resources for solving outstanding cases.
Are you excited?
It was laughed at. Try and solve cases, more resources for the RCMP. Aboriginal people wanted an inquiry, a study into the root causes of what would cause these women to go missing and murdered. It didn't matter that, this would be a 4th inquiry on the topic. They wanted another.
I earned my place at the table, literally, the operating room table. And when you earn your place at the table, you're respected, and your views are respected. When you're the number that's put at the table because of a quota, you're not respected, and therefore your voice isn't heard. So for myself, and I know the Prime Minister feels strongly about this as well, there are no quotas. Hi, Tessa.
1. Leading into the 2015 election, she was positioned as a star and campaigned with every single Ontario Conservative candidate. At some point in the election, she used this opportunity to feel out other people and see how they felt about her potential takeover of the party from Harper. Harper had been in government now for 18 years, with another decade running a non-profit. After 10 years as Prime Minister, many felt this would be Harper's last election, and he would have to step aside. Her and many other people were spending their time building support in the party instead of campaigning. Leitch became a person who would help Conservatives in trouble build more support since her riding was so secure. Midway through the campaign, stalwart and strong candidate, Minister of Immigration Chris Alexander, was caught up in a bit of a scandal. A little boy died in Turkey, and his aunt was claiming, in tears, that she applied to have that boy come to Canada, but the Conservatives rejected him.
Prime Minister made an announcement during the campaign. We're proud of those efforts, but we also, Rosemary, have to accept that no one will be able to resettle all these refugees. The ones that have come through human smuggling, through across borders, bribing officials, paying for train tickets and airline tickets, they are the lucky ones. There are millions more caught in the crossfire in these countries, and they are victims of jihadist terrorism that needs to be stopped in Syria and in Iraq. We stood against it in Afghanistan, prevented the Taliban from coming back to power there. We need to do the same and not stand in the sidelines militarily in Syria and Iraq.
Okay, but that's not what I'm suggesting. I'm asking what to do about refugees, and I take your point that you believe Canada is doing enough and that we can't help all of them. But surely there can be more. You can't look at those pictures and say that we've done enough.
No, that's why Prime Minister Harper, at the beginning of this campaign, added a commitment of 10,000 more Syrian refugees to be resettled to this country.
The reality was that she wrote a letter requesting her brother, the boy's uncle, the ability to bypass our immigration system and get into Canada. Obviously, that request was rejected. Leitch came in to offer Chris Alexander a helping hand. He was supposed to roll out a big campaign promise that polls said should have boosted the Conservatives in Quebec and Ontario. The idea was to create an RCMP tip line for people who wish to report cruel and barbaric cultural practices. The idea was that people go rat out on their Yazidi neighbors who were sacrificially killing a lamb or their Muslim neighbors who were wearing niqabs.
Many people believed it was divisive, even xenophobic. Why did you do that?
Well, I've been passionate about children my entire life. I'm a pediatric surgeon. I've supported many children's charities. And as Minister of Status of Women, I was focused on making sure that we eliminated violence against women and girls, especially making sure we advocated for women's rights, whether that's health and security. And I've had a lot of time to think about this since the campaign took place. And if I could go back in time, which I can't, I would change things.
The rollout for this was very flopped, and Leitch brought herself down with Alexander. Now, all anyone could remember Leitch as was that woman that hated Muslims. On election day, her riding was a lot closer than people suspected. She won with 5,000 votes. A clear win, but not nearly as big of a win as before.
Let me be clear. The Conservative Party is the only party that thinks ISIS is worth fighting. Our Conservative government has taken action in the fight against those who pose a threat and those who seek to destroy everything that we hold dear. Make no mistake, we will work to ensure that all Canadians are safe both here at home and abroad. This election is about the economy. These are turbulent times in the global market, and Canada is not immune to the impacts of downturns in China.
When Stephen Harper stepped down as Conservative Party leader, Leitch was the very first person to throw her name in the race. Shortly after was Maxime Bernier, who also was preparing for many years to take over the party. As a Harper loyalist, Leitch had a lot more difficult of a step to climb to becoming publicly popular than Bernier and Michael Chom, who were known as being people who opposed Harper on things. Leitch was early on regarded by the press as the Trump-like candidate.
If you've had it up to here with elites and corrupt politicians, consider me an orthopedic surgeon / university professor who's been involved in politics since she was 14.
Demonized heavily by her announcement of her first policy, immigrant screening. She proposed that all immigrants coming into Canada would have to be screened for Canadian values. As Joe Clark once famously said, Canadian values are those things politicians want you to agree with. Leitch was asked later to verify what those values were, to which she answered, anti-Canadian values are anti-gay, or lesbian, anti-woman, and anti-democracy. Some very generic answers. But the damage was done. People already saw her as being someone that was Trump-like. But surprisingly, it saw her gaining a huge chunk of popularity.
Freedom, and tolerance. Do they believe men?
It turns out people did want more screening for immigrants and refugees, not less. But more and more, her comments made it seem like she was drawing in the wrong crowd. She proclaimed that the elites in the party were trying to keep her out of power. She wanted to legalize pepper spray. She attended right-wing media protests and parties. Everything about her screamed extremist. But when you heard her speak, she sounded plain and boring.
We have a prime minister who calls us fringe? Really? There is nothing fringe about fighting for freedom of speech.
An anti-Leitch movement formed in which people would sign up for the Conservative Party just to make sure Leitch wasn't leading it. And that brings us to today.